Hey everyone, I hope this podcast and my blog and books have been helpful resources for you and will continue to be. But if you've been struggling with a chronic health problem and are feeling stuck, consider coming to work with my team and me at the California Center for Functional Medicine. We work with patients all over the US and have experience treating a wide range of conditions, including GI problems, autoimmunity, hypothyroidism, cognitive mood and behavioral issues, weight gain and metabolic dysfunction, and more. Our unique model teams clinicians with nurse practitioners and health coaches, all of whom are trained in my ADAPT framework approach to provide a high level of care to our patients. This means more support between appointments, personalized guidance on diet, lifestyle, and behavior change, a cutting-edge patient portal with 24/7 access to your labs and records, handouts and resources to guide your protocols, and a team of practitioners working together on your case. We're currently accepting new patients, so if you'd like to learn more, visit chriskresser.com/becomeapatient. Hey everyone, Chris Kresser here with a brief message before we begin the podcast. Imagine a career that draws on your passion for wellness and disease prevention, that harnesses your ability to support and connect with others, that helps you to develop as a person while you help others to do the same. What if you could earn a living while making an impact on thousands of people's lives and even on the future of healthcare? That'd be pretty great, right? Well, that job does exist. It's the job of a health coach, and I believe that health coaches will play a crucial role in the future of medicine, not only in the US, but around the world. 1 in 2 Americans now has a chronic disease, and 1 in 4 have multiple chronic diseases. Chronic disease is destroying our quality of life, shortening our lifespan, bankrupting governments, and threatening the health of future generations. And our medical model is not prepared to address it. Why? Because the only way to prevent or reverse chronic disease is by changing our diet, lifestyle, and behavior. And conventional medicine is simply not set up to do this. Bottom line, we need people who can provide this support to help people make the changes they need to make to save their lives. We need empathetic and compassionate people with a skill for connecting and a passion for change. And my job is to make sure they have all the training they need to do their job so well they will change the future of healthcare. A career as a health coach can be incredibly fulfilling both professionally and personally. It really could change your life, and it can also change the world. That's why I'm excited to announce that we're launching the ADAPT Health Coach Training Program. It's a 12-month, 100% online certification that will prepare you for a successful career as a health coach. It includes training in core coaching skills, functional health, ancestral diet and lifestyle, and professional development. And it's unlike any other health coach training program currently available. To be notified when enrollment opens and to learn more about the program, visit kresser.co/success. That's KRESSER.co/success. Now on to the show. Hey everybody, Chris Kresser here. Welcome to another episode of Revolution Health Radio. This week I'm really excited to welcome Will Harris as my guest on the show. Will is a 4th-generation cattleman who tends the same land that his great-grandfather settled way back in 1866. Born and raised at White Oak Pastures, Will left home to attend the University of Georgia School of Agriculture, where he was trained in the industrial farming methods that had taken hold after World War II. Will graduated in 1976 and returned to Bluffton, where he and his father continued to raise cattle using pesticides, herbicides, hormones, and antibiotics. They also fed their herd a high-carbohydrate diet of corn and soy. These tools did a fantastic job of taking the costs out of the system, but in the mid-1990s, Will became disenchanted with the excesses of these industrialized methods. They'd created a monoculture for their cattle, and as Will says, and as we'll discuss in the show, nature abhors a monoculture. In 1995, Will made the audacious decision to return to the farming methods his great-grandfather had used 130 years before. Since Will has successfully implemented these changes, he's been recognized all over the world as the leader in humane animal husbandry and environmental sustainability. Will is the immediate past president of the board of directors of Georgia Organics. He is the beef director of the American Grass-Fed Association and was selected 2011 Business Person of the Year for Georgia by the Small Business Administration. Will lives in his family home on the property with his wife, Yvonne. He's the proud father of 3 daughters, Jessie, Jenny, and Jody. His favorite place in the world to be is out in pastures, where he likes to have a big coffee at sunrise and a 750 milliliter glass of wine at sunset. I was really looking forward to this discussion with Will because I mentioned White Oak Pastures in a couple of my recent Joe Rogan appearances. They were the subject of a life cycle analysis that was performed by Qantas International that found that regenerative, holistically managed beef can actually sequester or remove carbon from the atmosphere rather than emitting it, which really completely turns the plant-based narrative on its head. Because as I'm sure you've heard, the claim is that beef production is always harmful to the environment. And as you'll learn in this interview with Will, there are much better methods for raising cattle that are not only better from an animal welfare perspective, they're also much better from an environmental perspective and a nutrition perspective. So let's dive into the interview. I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. Will Harris, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. I've really been looking forward to this.
Well, thank you for having me, Chris. Been looking forward to being with you guys.
So let's start with a little bit about your background and your story. I know you grew up at White Oak Pastures, and I believe went right into conventional methods of raising cattle, and then something happened. So tell us a little bit more about your story and how you came to be a regenerative rancher.
Okay, sure. So, pardon my voice. I got a little laryngitis today. I'll try to work through it. But the farm was actually started by my great grandfather in 1866. And
Wow.
He and my grandfather would have worked the land in a way that was very respectful to the land and the animals and the local community. My father, post-World War II, took over the farm, and that was the generation that industrialized, commoditized, centralized.
Right.
I went to the University of Georgia, majored into the College of Agriculture, graduated in 1976. Came back and further commoditized, industrialized, centralized, and operated that way successfully for 20 years and was financially comfortable, but did become increasingly dissatisfied with the unintended consequences of that sort of farming, and started making changes in the mid-90s and continued to make changes today.
Mm-hmm. What was the source of dissatisfaction? What were the signals that you were seeing that led you to believe that the typical way of doing it that's been in practice since World War II and maybe even a little before was not the best way to do it?
Well, it kind of evolved, but the first thing that really came to be disturbing to me was the animal welfare. Mm-hmm. I felt really good about my animal welfare until I focused on it and became dissatisfied and started changing it. And from that led me to questioning my land management. So I changed that, and regenerative land management became my passion and still is. But along the way, without really intending to, our way of farming had a tremendous impact on our little village of Bluffton, Georgia. And while I didn't set out to improve the town, I'm really pleased with that unintended consequence.
Mm-hmm. So maybe for the listeners who are not familiar or very familiar with holistic land management, maybe you could just kind of define that in a nutshell. What is it that you're doing at White Oak Pastures, and how is that different than a conventional feedlot operation?
Well, the way we manage land now is very regenerative. The way we did it previously was very reductive. What basically, industrial agriculture breaks the cycles of nature, the carbon cycle, the water cycle, the mineral cycle, the energy cycle, the microbial cycle, many cycles of nature. And those cycles are broken through the use of chemical fertilizers and tillage and pesticides and GMOs and antibiotics and hormones, etc. The way we farm today and have farmed for the last 20 years is a real focus on maximizing those natural cycles that I mentioned, and it has an enormous impact on the productivity of the land, the abundance returns.
And it also has a significant impact on carbon emissions, or in case of a regenerative operation like yours, even carbon sequestration. Can you speak to that a little bit? Because one of the ways that we got connected, of course, was when one of my recent appearances on Joe Rogan, I was countering the vegan narrative that beef production is a major, always has to be a major emitter of greenhouse gases and is comparable to, all of transportation, which is a claim that has been made by advocates of plant-based diets. And I mentioned a life cycle analysis that had been done at White Oak Pastures as an example of where producing beef can actually sequester, remove carbon from the atmosphere. So how does that work in a holistically managed operation such as yours?
Good. So carbon cycle is one of the cycles I mentioned. And while individually it's no more important than the other cycles, with reference to the pressing issue of climate change, it's arguably is more important. So the LCA, life cycle analysis that you mentioned, scientifically proved that this farm sequesters 3.5 pounds of carbon dioxide equivalent for every pound of beef we produce. To put that in perspective with the plant-based part, as you referred to, is Impossible Burger literally releases 3.5 pounds of carbon dioxide equivalent for every pound of Impossible Burger that they produce. So ironically, they are just exactly as bad for the environment as we are good for the environment.
Right.
Incredible coincidence.
It's remarkable. And just to be clear, that life cycle analysis was performed by the exact same independent firm, correct?
Yeah, both of them, to make it even more, by the exact same environmental engineering concern, Qantas from Minneapolis, Minnesota, and during the same time window. So it's just
right. So we can't say there were different methods or different analysis procedures because it was performed by the same group in the same window of time. And
what we in Georgia, we would say weighed on the same scales on the same day.
Right. So just to reiterate for the listeners here, that White Oak Pastures is removing as much carbon from the atmosphere per pound of beef that they produce as Impossible Burger, which is a plant-based fake meat burger, is emitting into the atmosphere with each pound of fake meat that they produce, which of course is completely counter to the narrative that we hear all the time now about how, going vegan will save the world, or if we just switch to plant-based alternatives like Impossible Burger, we're going to have this profoundly positive impact on the environment. And while we're on the subject, Will, maybe we could talk a little bit more about other issues with products like Impossible Burger that rely on monoculture, because I know you have said that nature abhors a monoculture. So, let's talk about that in the context of Impossible Burger, which is made with, I believe, GMO soy. And, what is the problem with relying on industrial scale agriculture to fix problems that industrial agriculture caused in the first place?
Well, you lay it out with the best line. Nature abhors a monoculture, and if you think about it, a monoculture exists nowhere in nature. Nowhere in nature is there a sea in which there's only one kind of fish. And there's no natural forest in which there's only one kind of tree or plant. No forest in which there's only foxes or only deer or only bobcats. The abundance of life that nature gives us when the cycles are working comes from different plants and animals and microbes, insects, all operating in symbiotic relationships with each other. Symbiosis explains the abundance of nature. It's literally 1 + 1 = 3. And that is the bounty that created the coal and oil and gas that's reserved, sequestered in the soil. It's where the energy and the wealth, the true wealth of the world comes from. And when you fly in the face of nature and create an enforced monoculture, you give up that symbiosis, and it's giving up the gift of life.
I sometimes wonder if, it seems like a lot of these fake meat products come out of or are started by people who come from a tech background, and it kind of goes along with this idea that technology can solve all problems. And there's almost, it seems to me, a profound disconnection from nature and natural cycles and that kind of thinking, and maybe even hostility towards those natural cycles. And really, if you trace back the birth of industrial agriculture and cattle practices, it also seems to really pick up speed with the increase in reliance on these new technologies. How has your operation changed over time in relationship with technology? Has that shifted? Are you using technology just in a different way? Are you using less technology, more? What would you say about that?
So let's be clear, I am not anti-technology, but I do know that technology is overused and used out of its place. So in holistic management, we talk about the difference in a complicated system and a complex system. A complicated system is like this computer that I'm talking on my cell phone, or my pickup truck that's parked outside. Mm-hmm. And that means there's a lot of things going on in it to make it work. And if any one of them shuts down, the system will stop. That is a complicated system. A complex system is like your body or the United States government or my farm, White Oak Pastures. And in a complex system, there's a lot of things going on within it to make it work. But if one component shuts down, the other components morph, and the system continues to operate. Now, reductionist science works beautifully on complicated systems. That's why this computer works, and why we're able to put a man on Mars and all the other miraculous things we've done.
Right.
Reductionist science does not work nearly so well in complex systems. That's why we've had drug recalls and pesticide recalls and herbicides that cause cancer and all these other unintended consequences, is because reductionist science tried to apply their system to a system in which it doesn't work well. So, on White Oak Pastures, we employ a lot of technology, but we ensure that we separate what is complex from what is complicated and apply the technology accordingly.
I really like that way of looking at it. It makes a lot of sense. Could you tell us a little bit more about what a holistically managed beef operation actually looks like? Again, for people who are not as familiar with the methods here, like how is it different specifically? People have maybe driven by a feedlot and seen cattle standing in a feedlot, and that's basically the extent of their understanding of what happens. But if you could give us paint us a little bit more of a picture of how a holistically managed operation differs, I think that would be helpful.
I will. So a holistically managed farm is, I call it biomimicry. It's the emulation of nature. It is looking at the ecosystem, the biome, and determining how this would look if we didn't interfere in it, and if man did not break the cycle. And that leads me to bring up animal agriculture, because animal production is a big part of what I do here. We raise cows, hogs, sheep, goats, rabbit, poultry, bees, and a number of other things. And it really troubles me when I hear people say that livestock in general, cattle in particular, are destroying the environment, when as an expert in land management, I can tell you with authority, there is no possible way to cost effectively regenerate degraded land without the use of animals. The earth evolved with animal impact as an essential component to its evolution. It probably goes back to brontosauruses being moved by Tyrannosaurus rex, but to be sure, it goes back to buffalo being moved by wolves, or caribou being moved by polar bears, or gazelles being moved by lions. But the creation came from herbivorous creatures having a hard impact on the land for a very short duration of time, with a very long recovery period. And the plants evolved to thrive in that environment over millions of years, and the animals evolved to thrive in that environment. And we emulate that, and it simply increases the productivity. It increases the organic matter in the land. That's how we sequester 3.5 pounds of carbon dioxide equivalent per every pound of beef. The plant photosynthesizes, it breathes in greenhouse gases. Much of that is sequestered beneath the surface in the roots. The herbivores come along, bite off the tops, defecate. Much of that winds up in the soil. Some goes up in enteric emissions, to be sure, but more of it is in the literally more, as proven by Qantas, goes into the soil. And that is literally the way that the reserves of gas and oil and coal got down there, is through the system I just described, with herbivores moved by predators. And in our system here, we emulate that every day. We humans replace the predators moving the animals, but it's biomimicry of the way the earth evolved.
So the cattle are being rotated, and then you've also got some synergy and interplay with the other animals you're raising, like chickens. How does that relationship work?
So there's symbiotic relationships between all the species of animals that we raise. They're all rotated around the landscape in different orders. No one linear. I reject linear management in a holistic, complex system. The animals are moved I call it prescriptive grazing. There are pieces of land that sometimes need the impact that hogs provide. Sometimes they need the impact that sheep or goats provide. Sometimes they need the impact that poultry provides. And as the land manager, having done it all my life, I make the prescription and we use the animals to provide the land with the impact that we think it needs at that point.
And how does the experience of the animals differ in this system? It's at the risk of pointing out the obvious. They're spending a lot more time outdoors on pasture in their natural environment. But you mentioned that animal welfare was one of the was the initial impulse for you to in your interest in holistic management. So, tell us a little bit about how this kind of method affects the lives of the animals and how that differs from the conventional operation.
So I mentioned earlier that the first facet of my operation that I felt compelled to change was the animal welfare. That predated me recognizing the ills of my land management practice. The idea of, to put it in very plain terms, there was a time that I profitably raised cattle by feeding chicken manure that I could buy very cheaply to the cattle, mixing it with enough corn and both chicken, which is very palatable to cattle. And by the way, manure is not a natural feedstuff for cattle. They will avoid it. And corn is not a natural feedstuff for cattle. It's just like feeding a kid candy.
Right.
Their rumen is not set up to digest, the ruminal stomach is not set up to digest that higher carbohydrate product. But the corn was the sugar that I put on the manure to make them eat. And I would literally put 50 pounds of antibiotics in it to keep them from getting sick. And as bizarre as that sounds, there are publications from land-grant universities that instruct farmers on how to do it. I was not the only person doing it. It was taught at the land-grant university. Now, also as bizarre as it sounds, you can put incredible weight gains on cattle by feeding them with those unnatural feedstuffs. There's a lot of reasons, physiological reasons for that we can get into, but there's profits to be made in doing that. Now, that was all done in confinement, and so that you could shut them up and make them eat it. And confinement is the industrial form of raising livestock, and it preempts the opportunity for the animals to express instinctive behavior. Cows were born to roam and graze, chickens were born to scratch and peck, hogs were born to root and wallow. In industrial confinement prevents those instinctive behaviors. And what that does is it puts the animal at a low level of stress 24/7. We tell ourselves we're keeping them fed, keeping them watered, keeping them at a comfortable temperature range. But if they can't express instinctive behavior, it's like me tying you to a chair and keeping you fed and keeping you watered and keeping you at a comfortable temperature range. It's a stressful environment.
Yes. Is there, I mean, I know a lot about the effects of stress on human beings and their health. I haven't done a deep dive on that, the science and the literature on that with cattle, but I imagine that doesn't, it's not good for their physiological health to be under that kind of stress.
Well, I'm not a doctor or a psychiatrist or a researcher. I'm a farmer, but I can tell you that a confinement cow shut up in a confinement in a feedlot, fed a unnatural diet of corn and whatever you put in with it, creates an unnaturally obese creature that would never exist in nature. Mm-hmm. That animal would not live a normal life expectancy if it was granted a presidential pardon and just kept in that feedlot. If it weren't slaughtered when it was 18 or 20 or whatever months of age, just left in, it would not live nearly to the 20-something years that would be the normal life expectancy of a cow. I don't, I'm not a nutritionist, but I really don't know why we think that eating a creature that is dying of the diseases of obesity and sedentary lifestyle is good for you. Doesn't make much sense to me.
Do you think that might create a vicious cycle where the animals are less healthy because they're living in those kind of confinement conditions, and then they require more medication and other kinds of interventions because of that?
I think that's exactly what happens. Yes.
Mm-hmm. So with the holistically managed cattle, you would you say you have a lot less to do? You have to move them around and do the things that go along with that kind of management, but is less intervention required in general?
It's certainly far less medication involved. Yes.
Yeah. Uh-huh. So I also want to follow up on something you said earlier about how the changes to the local community, that again, that was not necessarily your intention setting out, or you weren't anticipating that as a beneficial side effect, but that there have been some positive impacts on the local community from the type of farming that you're doing now, and maybe some negative impacts that were also unintended before. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So the centralization, industrialization, commoditization that we discussed earlier, another unintended consequence of it is it caused the rural America to be irrelevant. The villages like Bluffton, Georgia, became irrelevant under that style of farming. It's not unique, and it's not even regional. North, south, east, west, Midwest. You don't have to get very far out of the cities to find little small rural farming towns that are in decay. They're impoverished. And that occurred when we changed agriculture, and nobody needed the little town anymore.
Right.
I live in a county that peaked in population in 1900. Every census since then, the population has declined. It's one of the poorest counties in one of the poorest states. It's the poorest county in one of the poorest states in the nation. And it had literally dried up. The only thing you could buy in Bluffton, Georgia, 10 years ago was a postage stamp. And the post office was open about an hour a day. Today, White Oak Pastures is the largest private employer in the county. We have 160 something employees. My employees made twice the county average last year. I write checks, payroll checks for over $100,000 every Friday in a town of a little over 100 people. And the town is again relevant. And we've opened a store and a restaurant and bought a dozen houses that we've fixed. We've renovated the old courthouse, renovated one of the old churches, a number of other things. Bluffton is a little town. It is a delightful little town again. And it had fallen to as great a level of decay of any little farming community I know of.
That must be really gratifying.
It was a positive. It was not the goal, but it was a positive unintended consequence. Most of the unintended consequences in my life have been negative, but this one was not.
Yeah, those are the best ones, right? Yeah. You and I have mentioned the concept of a life cycle assessment, and many of my listeners will be familiar with that. But for those who aren't, let's break that down. I'm switching gears here a little bit, but we talked earlier about how White Oak Pastures removes, was it 3.5 or 3.7?
3.5.
3.5 tons of carbon per how many
4 or 5 pounds of CO2 equivalent for every pound of beef we produce.
CO2 equivalent, right? And this was the important thing about this analysis. It was a full life cycle analysis, and I want to differentiate that between, sometimes when you see these comparisons between the emissions that come from transportation and then the emissions, greenhouse gas emissions that come from beef, they're somewhat disingenuous because they're only comparing what are called direct or tailpipe emissions of transportation, which is just the very final stage, the last stage of the transportation emissions. It's just what comes out of the tailpipe of the vehicle. It doesn't account for any of the manufacturing or the distribution of fuel or anything like that. And then they're comparing that with the full life cycle of beef, right? Which considers all of the inputs and the machinery, equipment, and then, the methane that comes out of the cow. So why is this life cycle assessment so important?
Well, I guess I have a couple answers. It's important because it flies in the face of everything we've been told about animal impact on the environment for the last 10 plus years. So that's why it's important. It shows that it's absolutely not what we've been told. The story we've been told about livestock impact on the environment has been based solely upon industrial centralized confinement feeding. They did not tell the story of raising livestock the way I raise it.
Right.
That I'm in a different industry. I'm not in the confinement animal industry, and my life cycle assessment is very different from what theirs would look like, and it is. So that's why it's important. And I think I should tell your listeners a little bit about the origins of this life cycle assessment. We're selling some products, some beef and pork and turkey and maybe chicken, to a little company called Epic, E-P-I-C, a meat company bar from Austin, Texas.
Yeah, many of the listeners will be familiar with that. They probably eat a lot of Epic bars themselves.
Okay, good. We were doing business with them when they were privately owned by an entrepreneurial young couple that I had met. In fact, I met them in Zimbabwe when I was taking my holistic management training. It's the first time I met those people. But we started doing business and did business for a couple of years. And they called one day to say that they had sold their company to General Mills. And I was happy for them because I feel like that was an economic benefit for them. But I figured that would wind up my relationship with Epic. I didn't think I would sell product to General Mills because that's just not usually the way it works.
Yeah.
Hard for a family farm to fit in with a big multinational corporation. But they continued to buy from me, which was nice. I had a visit from their VP of Sustainability, and he made it was clear that he had some trepidation about the claims that the Epic people were making, and me too through that, about our regenerative practices. And his feeling is there's no paper in the file to prove it, and he was right about that. It's pretty anecdotal. So he made me an offer. He agreed to pay for this life cycle assessment, which I'd never heard of before. And it was a lot of money, like $60,000. If I would participate and provide the information, which probably cost me $20,000, and we jointly own the information. And I agreed to do it. And he chose this Qantas and sent those people down. And it was a tough year. I mean, we had to prove everything to them, how much electricity we burn, how much gas, how much waste we put out, how much water we use. It was a lot more in depth and troublesome than I thought it would be. But we were all in. And of course, the rest is history. When it came back, it showed that not only are we not a problem, we are part of the solution for climate change. I'm very glad we did it. But I can't get, because I don't know, it's not a secret, but I don't know, I can't explain the scientific procedure to you. It's above my pay grade. Qantas can and will, and the life cycle analysis is available on our website, whiteoakpastures.com, in the environmental section. So that is the report. And I can tell you all you want to know about how to sequester carbon, improve the land, improve the water, improve the air. I can't talk to you much about the scientific procedure of quantifying it.
Sure. No, that's fine. It's just, I think, important for the listeners to understand the concept of life cycle analysis, which includes all of the, it's kind of a cradle to grave analysis that looks at not just the emissions at the end of the cycle, but all of the steps that come in the cycle previously. And the problem with some of these previous comparisons that have been made, as I mentioned before, about, with greenhouse gas emissions from transportation and greenhouse gas emissions from beef, is that they were using only the tailpipe or direct emissions from transportation, and then comparing that with the full life cycle analysis, not of holistically managed beef, but of conventionally managed beef. So I think the numbers were, that are typically used, that transportation accounts for 14% of greenhouse gas emissions, and that conventionally raised cattle is about 14%. But that's the standard life, that's the full life cycle of cattle versus just the tailpipe or direct emissions for transportation. And then if you only look at the direct emissions, globally, cattle accounts for 5% and transportation for 14%. And again, that's conventionally raised cattle. And in the US, that number is 3.9% for conventionally raised cattle. And then if we go many steps further to holistically managed beef, not only are there no direct emissions or even full life cycle emissions, there's a negative. It's sequestering carbon from the atmosphere. So that's a huge paradigm shift, or from the typical narrative. And I think it's so important for people to understand that, and yet very few people do at this point, unfortunately.
We say it ain't the cow, it's the how.
Exactly. So I want to finish up by talking a little bit about probably one of the most common, criticisms or questions that is raised about, holistically managed beef, or, any holistically managed animal operation is, okay, well, that's great that this is working for you on a small scale, but can we really scale this up to be able to feed the world? And, is this really practical on a larger scale? What are your thoughts about that?
Well, the short answer is yes. One thing you've got to consider is the fact that this is very cyclical versus linear. White Oak Pastures is highly replicatable. It's not highly scalable. White Oak Pastures is about $20 million a year for a farm, and that may be about as big as we need to be. Mm-hmm. But there could be 1 or 2 or 3 White Oak Pastures in every agricultural county in the nation, and there probably should be. So, a linear business, like if you're in the business of making Taurus automobiles, right, and the demand double, you just put twice as many assembly lines in, it's highly scalable. You just keep doing that. A business like ours that's full of cycles is not that way, but you can have more and more of them quite easily. Keep in mind that White Oak Pastures was built by a proud C student from the College of Agriculture at the University of Georgia on bank debt. You're not talking about a Fulbright scholar with a trust fund. So what we've done here is highly replicatable. We've got a pretty active internship program and have a lot of, we have interns here all the time, structured program. And I think we're creating more White Oak Pastures every time we do it. So I'm not sure that you're going to see, let's point fingers and place blame here just for a second. I really don't think that you will see one or two or three White Oak Pastures in every ag county in the nation, even though we'd all be better off. But it's not the fault of the farmer. It's the fault of the consumer.
Right.
If this kind of agriculture does grow, it won't be because there's regulation that requires it. And it won't be because farmers just think, wow, I really ought to change up and do that. And it won't be because, I'm going on, it won't be because of anything in the world other than consumer demand. Wendell Berry is a role model of mine, and he's, you know Wendell Berry? You know who that is?
I do. I love Wendell Berry. Yes.
He's a role model of mine, and he says something like, consumers vote every day with their purchasing dollar on how they want the world to be. And there's never been any truer statement. And because I feel that Americans are hopelessly addicted to obscenely cheap food, we probably won't see it happen, but we should. But we can't blame it on the fact it's not scalable. It's highly replicatable.
Yeah. One of my favorite Wendell Berry quotes, which I'm sure you can relate to, is "Eating is an agricultural act," he says.
Yeah.
So, yeah. And I know, others like Alan Savory have argued that holistically managed beef may be the only way we can feed the world because of how it regenerates soil, and that, the erosion of soil and the decline of soil quality around the world is one of the biggest environmental threats that we're facing now. And that, as you pointed out earlier in the interview, that you cannot effectively, we don't know of any other way right now to regenerate soil quality without animals and ruminants.
Right. With industrial, commoditized, centralized farming versus holistic farming, it depends on what we're going to run out of first. What resource is exhausted first? Industrial farming is intensive in terms of use of petroleum. It uses up the antibiotics that the pathogens are not immune to. It uses up the life of the sea. It uses up our ability, resilience against global warming. It uses up, and we just go through all the reductive impacts of that kind of farming and decide which one we think is going to be the most resilient. I think I know, but I guess I'd be happy to have that debate with anyone that wants to have it.
Yeah, I mean, this is a conversation that really, I hope, continues to be had and on a bigger and wider scale. I was happy to have the opportunity to talk about it a little bit on the Joe Rogan show, and I know, there's both a film and a book coming out, Sacred Cow, which is going to. Is your farm featured in that film? I can't recall.
No, but Diana, who is the brilliant nutritionalist that's doing it, is a friend of mine, and she is representing other farms that I have enormous respect for. So while White Oak Pastures is not a subject of that book, I'm a great supporter. Diana Rogers is the real deal.
Yeah, and I know she's, of course, very familiar with you and your work. And you said earlier, it's not the cow, it's the how. I have a t-shirt that says that on it from Diana. So I know we had her as a friend in common. But it's heartening to me that this story is starting to get out there on a bigger scale. And I think Diana's book and film is going to make a huge difference there on reaching even more people, because that's a medium that is so accessible, and that there's a certain number of people that will read a book, but there's a lot greater number of people that will watch a film. So I'm really looking forward to this message getting out there, because it's something that can make a huge impact on a number of the challenges that we face, ranging from nutrition to climate change to the health of local communities and all of the other things that we've talked about today. So Will, thank you so much for coming on to the show. It's been a pleasure to speak with you, and just want to express my admiration and respect for what you're doing at White Oak Pastures, and serving as a model for so many other farmers out there who I know would like to move in that direction.
Well, thank you very much for having me on today. It's been an honor and a privilege.
Okay, everybody, thanks for listening. Send in your questions to kresser.com/podcast question, and we'll see you next time. That's the end of this episode of Revolution Health Radio. If you appreciate the show and want to help me create a healthier and happier world, please head over to iTunes and leave us a review. They really do make a difference. If you'd like to ask a question for me to answer on a future episode, you can do that at kresser.com/podcast question. You can also leave a suggestion for someone you'd like me to interview there. If you're on social media, you can follow me at twitter.com/KrisKresser or facebook.com/KrisKresserLAC. I post a lot of articles and research that I do throughout the week there that never makes it to the blog or podcast, so it's a great way to stay abreast of the latest developments. Thanks so much for listening. Talk to you next time.